instead of actually pursuing sex, which is, of course, in a natural circumstance, a very difficult puzzle to solve, because the consequences before birth control for women having sex with somebody were so spectacularly high that women in general would not consider having sex with anybody who did not show very strong evidence of a willingness to commit. So that was the sort of fundamental underlying logic of sex. It was very, very scarce, and one had to achieve substantial things in order to become worthy of it. And that gave a kind of logic to the system. But once you remove that, then it becomes, you almost have people aligning with some specialized version of sex in the same way that they, root for Manchester United or whatever it is. It's a radical transition in one's relationship to sexuality. The other thing I wanted to introduce here, and this is again a place where I just have a very hard time conveying to people what I'm talking about, but I think the problem in some sense comes down to the idea that sex is a recreational activity. And if you say, oh, it's not recreational, then people assume that what you're saying is that
it's utilitarian.
Yeah, that it's utilitarian, when in fact it is supposed to be extremely private and unthinkably powerful. And that combination of things is part of the logic that we've lost. And so we've substituted in this very low quality, sex is something you can do with anybody, right? And
I made a very similar case actually in the last chapter of the book, where I've made the case for rewilding, as I've called it, rewilding sex, and which is it's the pro-sex case against birth control, on the basis that, in much the same way as to rewild an area to rewild an ecosystem, sometimes you have to reintroduce the apex predator, because otherwise the ecosystem just doesn't work. My argument is that we won't be able to move sex out of this empty, sterile, recreational terrain and back into its proper seriousness and take it seriously, and with the pleasures that come with that, unless we're willing to reintroduce the danger. Wow. And although I can't prove it, it is my hunch that a great deal of the so-called BDSM culture would disappear overnight if we allowed the true seriousness and the true danger of what sex is actually for back into the picture again. All of these young women who are being choked or slapped or otherwise physically abused, and a lot of them genuinely want it. This is a controversial thing to say. And my great friend Louise Perry we argue back and forth about BDSM, and it's clear enough to me from women I speak to that a great many of them they ask, and I hear from this from young men as well, that girls who they're with, they're asking to be choked or slapped or whatever, and honestly, Brett, I think it's because they just want to feel something. That's what's going on. And if you take, being slightly more flippant about it, contraceptive sex is like vegan bacon. It's kind of the same. But is it any wonder that people are adding a lot of hot sauce because the flavor just isn't quite there? And I think if you add the danger back in, then a lot of the violence, the degradation, and the extreme and the sexual tribalism that you've been characterizing would disappear.
Well, I think there are two ways that we could view your argument. One of them, I think, is almost certainly true, which is if you did reintroduce the high stakes nature, that you would see a clarification of people's sexual selves. I won't say instantly, because many people, will never get over being downstream of all the porn they've watched, but quickly you would see that transition. The question is that the only way? And this is where I don't know if you and I differ, but I would argue it is not the only way that basically if one were to opt out as a couple or as a community and opt into rules that again restored the specialness, and basically that's, I guess, a code word here for the scarcity of sex. In other words, that it is the result of really impressing somebody, I suppose, that would do it without necessarily having to eliminate birth control from the scenario. Because as you said earlier in the conversation, whether or not it would be a good idea to eliminate birth control, I do not think it would, but whether or not it would, it won't happen, right? We've already...
Right. No, I completely agree with that. But however, it's perfectly within the power of any young woman who, I mean, there are a great many young women all over TikTok and Instagram and wherever else, talking about how they were put on birth control at the age of 14, and then they came off it in their early 20s and had a complete personality transplant, and are now outraged at what happened to them and what was done to them. When they were given this extremely psychoactive substance for a number of years, which completely de-risked sex and left them without any robust reason to say no to any number of acts, which some of them now greatly regret. And have now come off it and discovered that there's a whole raft of psychological symptoms which they thought was just something that they had to live with, was in fact this medication which they were taking in order to make them consequence-free participants in the quote-unquote sexual marketplace. And there are a lot of young women who are extremely angry about that. And natural family planning is a subculture all of its own among women a great deal younger than me, and not even just religious conservatives, not by a long chalk. And again, I keep coming back to the optimism. It must just be something about you, but you really bring it out in me. But one of the really positive stories, potentially, one of the more positive uses of tech that I've heard of recently is a huge number of advances in tech which supports a more embodied and a more realist approach to family planning. So there are technological, there are apps, there are other technologies which have been developed which support being able to work with your natural cycles as a woman and to be able to manage your fertility in that way without having to take a pill which messes up your endocrine system and makes you fat and sexless and mad. Just in order to take the complexity out of it. And I think innovations like that, which work with our organismic nature rather than against it, I see as being potentially hugely positive. But they all take more effort. And at the end of the day, if change is going to come on this, it will begin with women, because the sexual revolution began with women. It began with women saying yes to this paradigm, and it will end with women saying we've had enough of this.
The behavior that you were describing, women being beaten up during sex, and your difficult truth that, in fact, in some cases, they are asking for this. And I wanted to point out, yes, okay, I suppose maybe they're asking for this to happen, but in part they're asking for it to happen because it is expected that they will ask, right? Now, I watch no porn, so I don't really know. I'm going on reports by other people. But porn has normalized sexual violence to such a degree that I think young people who naturally look to sexual examples around them are finding porn and unfortunately taking it in as if it were informative about what sex is supposed to look like. Yep. And I would also just add to that this is a great place to see the issue of something that is not supposed to be transactional, right? It's not to say that there's no aspect of transactional behavior in normal sex, but it has been made utterly transactional, and it has been commodified by an industry that feeds sexual appetites with no negative consequence for that industry if people are made unhealthy, unhappy, unsatisfied as a result of consuming this particular product. But in any case, what I wanted to point out is the thing about porn is you've got a bunch of vendors that have basically become parasites on human sexuality, that they are selling human sex acts. And it is very hard to distinguish your particular brand from anybody else's in that market because you're all selling the same thing. And what that does is it means that in the competition for attention and therefore dollars in pornography, you have a natural tendency towards extreme sexual behavior. right?
Yeah, as I understand it, regular consumers swiftly become desensitized as well. So you have to go looking for more extreme content simply to feel anything at all after a certain point. I mean, Louise writes very compellingly about this. She calls it cultural death grip.
Yes.
After the young men who talk about death grip syndrome, which is to say they're unable to experience an orgasm except through manipulating themselves in extreme and painful ways, and they're just not able to have an orgasm in normal intercourse at all anymore, because they've just warped their nerve endings and their mental pathways to the extent that it's just not possible anymore.
Yes, and unfortunately, what they don't understand, I think it's a lot like an addictive product like cigarettes, where the person who smokes a cigarette,
it's completely an addictive product like cigarettes, yeah.
They think it may, will give them a high, does not understand that they are changing what normal feels like. And so this is a developmental process that is, I won't say it's not reversible at all. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but it's not easily reversed. And what that means, again, there are things about the evolutionary story of what human sexuality is that are profound, and I think also just not well understood by most humans. One is that sex in humans doesn't look like other creatures. Right? Sex in humans serves the same role it serves in other creatures, but we have been granted this incredible gift. This is a bonding exercise, and that is why it continues after the cessation of reproductive capacity, after menopause. That's why it happens in humans when females are not fertile, not at a fertile point in their cycle. This is something that selection has altered in humans for something very important, which is bonding with somebody whom you're going to team up with in the raising of a family. And so then the upshot of these two arguments put together is, if you turn your sexuality over to outsiders who have no interest in your long-term well-being, if you outsource your sexual fantasizing to pornographers and they embrace an extreme and violent view of sex because that's the only way for them to sell what they're selling and compete with their competitors, then at the point that you take that very powerful gift that you have and you attempt to use it to form a partnership with somebody, a lifelong partnership, then what do you do with all the despicable stuff that got loaded into your sexual mindset, right? That stuff now
Absolutely.
interfaces with the person who you should be trying to keep it away from.
Yeah, absolutely. Once it's in there, it's very hard to get rid of it again.